The message popped up just as I was about to turn off the engine. Urgent, O-negative needed. Active bleeding. Naval Medical Center, Norfolk. Please share. I stared at the screen, my fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel, the tick of the cooling engine echoing in the quiet parking lot. I almost kept scrolling. I had already given 16 hours to the uniform that day, but something about the phrasing active bleeding lodged in my chest like a splinter. 10 minutes later, I was back on the highway driving into the night to give blood to someone I'd never met. 2 weeks later, I would walk into my commander's office and find a man wearing 4 stars waiting for me. The night had started like any other long one at Joint Expeditionary Logistics Support Unit, a stretch of gray hangars and sodium lights just outside Norfolk. My name is Major Laura Bennett, United States Army Medical Logistics Corps. 20 years in uniform teaches you to measure your day in shipments, checklists, and quiet decisions no one else ever sees. That afternoon, we'd processed 3 emergency airlift pallets bound for a hurricane staging area in Georgia. The wind off the coast had been sharp, carrying the smell of diesel and salt, and by the time the last crate rolled onto the transport, my shoulders felt like sandbags. I remember sitting in my pickup in the far corner of the lot, the radio murmuring some late-night talk show, the kind that fills silence without asking for attention. My boots were still dusty from the loading bay, and my right hand ached from signing manifests. I had already texted my sister that I'd call her the next day. I had already decided dinner would be whatever was left in the fridge. My mind had narrowed to one simple goal: go home, shower, sleep. Then my phone buzzed. The post came from a local veterans group I followed mostly out of habit. The photo attached showed nothing dramatic, just a hospital hallway, and a caption typed in all caps. The words were clinical, almost blunt. O-negative. Trauma case. Family requesting donors. Time critical. I read it once, then again. O-negative, universal donor, the rare card in my wallet that I'd almost forgotten about. I leaned back in the seat. "You're exhausted," I muttered to no one. "They'll find someone else." The thought felt reasonable, even responsible. My shift had technically ended and I had another early briefing. The drive to Naval Medical Center, Norfolk would take 20 minutes in light traffic longer if the bridge slowed. There were probably dozens of donors already heading there. But my thumb hovered over the screen. The post had only been up 6 minutes, 2 shares, 1 comment: "Please hurry." The parking lot was empty except for a maintenance truck idling near the far fence. The wind rattled a loose sign somewhere behind me. I thought about the times I'd coordinated emergency supplies for strangers, bandages, IV fluids, field kits, never knowing who they were or whether they made it. This felt different. This was immediate, personal, measured in minutes instead of manifests. I exhaled slowly. "All right," I said almost under my breath. "Let's go." The engine turned over with a familiar rumble. I pulled out of the lot, the base gate lights fading in the rearview mirror. The road toward Norfolk stretched dark and quiet, lined with low marshland, and the occasional flicker of porch lights in the distance. My fatigue didn't disappear, but it settled into the background, replaced by a steady, purposeful calm. The kind that comes when you've made a decision, and the rest is just motion. Traffic was light. A tanker truck passed in the opposite lane, headlights slicing through the dark. My phone buzzed again, another share, another comment. Family waiting. I tightened my grip on the wheel. I didn't know who they were. A sailor, a civilian, a kid. The uncertainty made the silence in the cab feel heavier. By the time I crossed the Elizabeth River, the hospital's lights were already visible against the night sky. Naval Medical Center, Norfolk always looked different after midnight, quieter, more solemn. The emergency entrance glowed white ambulances parked like sentries along the curb. I pulled into visitor parking and shut off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the ticking metal and distant hum of generators. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. A volunteer at the desk looked up, surprised. "Are you here for the donor call?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "O-negative." She nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face. "They'll be grateful. Right this way." The donor room was half-lit, a handful of chairs arranged in neat rows. A nurse handed me forms, her voice efficient but kind. "We've had a few people come in. You're one of the first with the right type." I signed where she pointed, rolled up my sleeve, and settled into the chair. The vinyl was cool against my arm. As the needle slid in, I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations. The machine hummed softly beside me. I focused on my breathing, steady and even. I'd donated before, but tonight felt heavier, more immediate. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone was fighting to stay alive. My part in it was small, measured in ounces, but it was something. When the bag filled, the nurse smiled. "You're all set, Major. Take it easy for a bit." I sat up, slowly flexing my fingers. That's when I noticed him. He was seated in the chair next to mine, though I hadn't seen him arrive. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Gray hair, posture straight, despite the fatigue in his eyes. He wore a simple jacket and slacks, nothing that marked him as military. But there was something about the way he held himself calm, composed, that made me look twice. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I heard them mention your blood type." I shrugged, just saw the post. He studied me for a moment as if committing something to memory. Not everyone does. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. The room was quiet except for the low hum of equipment. After a pause, he added, "May, I ask your name?" "Laura Bennett," I replied. "Major, Army." He nodded slowly. "I appreciate what you did tonight, Major Bennett. You may have done more than you realize." I offered a small smile, just glad I could help. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat back, eyes distant, as if listening for news from somewhere deeper in the hospital. After a moment, I stood, thanked the nurse, and headed for the door. As I left, I glanced back. He raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement. Outside, the night air felt cooler. I climbed into my truck, my arm slightly sore, and started the engine. The hospital lights faded behind me as I drove toward home. I didn't know who the patient was. I didn't know if the donation would make a difference. But the decision felt right, simple, clean, complete. I had no idea that the man in that chair would be waiting for me again in 2 weeks, wearing 4 silver stars and holding my future in his hands. The sugar cookies they handed me tasted like cardboard, but I ate one anyway, more out of habit than hunger. The donor lounge was quiet, the fluorescent lights softened for the late hour, and the hum of the hospital seemed to settle into something almost peaceful. My arm throbbed faintly where the bandage pressed against the crook of my elbow. I leaned back in the chair, letting the dizziness pass the way the nurse had instructed, counting slow breaths. Across from me, the man who had thanked me earlier sat with his hands folded, gaze fixed on the floor as if measuring time in silence. It's strange how you notice small things when you're tired. The crease in his jacket was sharp despite the long night. His shoes were polished, not flashy, just well cared for. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't pace. He waited with the stillness of someone used to letting events unfold without interference. I'd seen that posture before, officers waiting outside surgical wards, commanders listening for word after an operation, parents who understood panic wouldn't speed anything up. The nurse returned with a clipboard. "We're stabilizing him now," she told the man gently. "The transfusion is helping." His shoulders lowered just a fraction, the only visible sign of relief. "Thank you," he said, voice calm but heavy with meaning. I looked down at the empty wrapper in my hands. So it was a him. A son, maybe. A grandson. I didn't ask. It felt intrusive. The hospital had its own rhythm, and we were just 2 people sharing a quiet corner inside it. After a few minutes, he spoke again. "You drove in from base." "Yes, sir," I said automatically, then caught myself. He wasn't in uniform. Sorry, Habit. He gave a faint smile. "No apology needed. Old habits usually mean experience." "Army Medical Logistics," I said, "stationed nearby." "That explains the decisiveness," he replied. "You didn't hesitate long." I shrugged, long enough to almost go home. He nodded as if that mattered. Most people would have. The nurse passed again, adjusting a machine. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and stopped abruptly. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. The man leaned back, studying the ceiling. "My daughter posted that message," he said after a moment. "She didn't think anyone would see it in time." I turned toward him. I'm glad I did. "So am I." His voice softened. "Family doesn't prepare you for moments like this. You think you're ready. Then suddenly you're not." I understood that. The uniform teaches you to handle emergencies, but it doesn't shield you from the human side of them. "He'll be okay," I said, not because I knew, but because it felt necessary. He looked at me, eyes steady. "He already is because people like you showed up." The nurse approached again. "You can see him briefly, sir. Just for a minute." The man stood smoothing his jacket. Before he followed her, he turned back to me. "I didn't catch your full name earlier." "Laura Bennett." He repeated it quietly as if filing it away. "Thank you, Major Bennett." "You're welcome." He hesitated, then added, "You may never know what tonight means to my family, but I will." The words were simple, delivered without theatrics. Then he followed the nurse down the hall. I sat there a moment longer, the silence settling again. The dizziness had faded, replaced by a calm fatigue. After another cookie and a cup of water, I gathered my things and left the donor room. The hallway outside was brighter, nurses moving with practiced efficiency. Somewhere a monitor beeped steadily. I passed the waiting area and caught a glimpse of the man standing beside a hospital bed inside a partially open door. His posture had softened, one hand resting gently on the blanket. I didn't linger. The moment belonged to him, not me. Outside, the air carried the damp chill of the coast. The parking lot lights reflected off the pavement, turning everything silver. I slid into my truck and rested my head briefly against the seat. My body felt heavier now, the adrenaline gone. The engine started and I eased onto the road, the hospital shrinking in the mirror. The drive home blurred into a quiet ribbon of asphalt. A cargo ship's lights flickered in the distance across the water. The radio murmured low. My arm ached slightly, a reminder of the small exchange that had taken place, blood for time, time for hope. I didn't think about recognition or consequence. I assumed the night would fade into memory like so many other small decisions that never surface again. At a red light near the base entrance, my phone buzzed again. Another update from the same veterans page, donor found. "Thank you all. Patient stable." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That was enough, more than enough. I reached my quarters just after midnight. The hallway was quiet, the hum of air conditioning the only sound. I kicked off my boots, set my keys on the table, and ran the shower hot. The water stung my shoulders, washing away the smell of diesel and antiseptic. As steam filled the bathroom, the events of the night replayed in fragments. The post, the drive, the man's calm voice. "You may have done more than you realize." It sounded dramatic in hindsight, but he hadn't said it that way. Just a quiet statement, like someone noting the weather. I shook my head, dismissing it. People say things in hospitals they don't mean to sound profound. Stress bends words. I fell asleep almost instantly, the exhaustion finally catching up. Morning came too soon, sunlight slicing through the blinds. My alarm buzzed at 0600. My arm felt stiff but manageable. I dressed in uniform, pinned my ribbons, and headed back to base. The day unfolded like any other briefings, inventory reports, supply coordination. No one mentioned the previous night. No medals, no emails, no follow-up calls. Exactly as I expected. The Army runs on continuity, not sentiment. I moved through tasks methodically, the memory of the hospital settling quietly in the background. At lunch, Lieutenant Harris glanced at the bandage on my arm. "You donate." "Yes." "Must have been urgent. They don't usually call you in that late." "Just saw a post," I said. He nodded, already returning to his tray. The conversation ended there. No fanfare, no curiosity. It suited me fine. That afternoon, as I finalized a shipment manifest, I caught myself wondering about the man. Not his identity, just whether his grandson or son was sitting up, whether the transfusion had held. I hoped so. Then I pushed the thought aside. My role had ended in that chair. 2 days later, the bandage came off. The mark faded. The routine resumed fully. If anyone had told me then that the quiet conversation in that donor room would echo through the chain of command, I would have laughed. Life rarely circles back that neatly. But 2 weeks later, when the message came through, Major Bennett report to the commander's office at 0900, I would remember his steady eyes, his measured voice, and the way he'd repeated my name as if it mattered. At the time, I assumed it was just another briefing, another routine correction, another day in uniform. I had no idea that the man who only asked my name would be sitting behind that door waiting for me with 4 silver stars on his shoulders. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 days after the donation, and it arrived not with drama but with a calendar notification. Mandatory Readiness Review 0730. I remember staring at the screen, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to reconstruct my schedule. The night I'd driven to the hospital, I'd logged out late, slept barely 4 hours, and reported in just before 0800. No one had said anything at the time. The briefing had already started, and I'd slipped quietly into the back, taken notes, and continued my day. It seemed minor routine friction in a busy unit. But the notification wasn't routine. When I stepped into the conference room, the air felt unusually formal. My battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dwyer, sat at the head of the table, his posture, straight expression, unreadable. A few other officers were present, laptops open, the soft clatter of keys filling the silence. I took a seat, sensing immediately that this wasn't about supply metrics. Dwyer cleared his throat. "Major Bennett, before we begin, I'd like you to stay after. Brief discussion." "Yes, sir." The meeting itself passed in a blur of logistics charts and readiness numbers. My mind stayed anchored to the quiet tension in his voice. When the others filed out, he gestured for me to remain. The door closed softly behind the last officer. He folded his hands. "Major, I've reviewed your time logs from last Thursday night." "Yes, sir." "You departed base at 21:30. No official tasking. You returned at 0:15, correct?" "Yes, sir. He held up a hand. "I also noted you arrived late to the morning readiness briefing. 10 minutes." "I did, sir." "And you did not request schedule adjustment?" "No, sir." He leaned back, eyes steady. "Where were you?" I hesitated only briefly. "Naval Medical Center, Norfolk, sir. There was an urgent donor request. I have O negative." He studied me for a moment. "You left base to donate blood?" "Yes, sir." "On your own initiative?" "Yes, sir." The silence that followed felt heavier than I expected. I'd imagined mild acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. Instead, he exhaled slowly. "Major Bennett. I appreciate initiative, but we operate within structure. You were off shift but still on call. If an overnight logistics issue had arisen, you would have been unavailable." "I kept my phone on, sir." "That's not the point." His tone wasn't harsh, just firm. "Decisions like that require coordination. You made a personal call that affected operational readiness." I nodded. "Understood, sir." He watched me carefully, as if measuring my reaction. "I'm not issuing formal discipline, but I am documenting the deviation. You'll temporarily transfer to administrative support while we reassess coverage." The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. Administrative support meant desk duty, data review, inventory tracking, internal coordination. No field runs, no convoy oversight, no operational planning. It wasn't punishment in name, but it felt like one. "Yes, sir," I said. He slid a paper across the desk. "Effective immediately. This is temporary. Maintain professionalism." I signed. My hand didn't shake, but I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Not anger, more a dull surprise. I hadn't expected praise, but I hadn't expected this either. I stood, saluted, and left the room. Outside, the corridor buzzed with normal activity boots on tile radios, crackling, someone laughing near the stairwell. The ordinariness of it all made the moment feel oddly isolated, as if the decision existed in a bubble only I could see. Lieutenant Harris caught up with me. "Everything good?" "Just reassignment," I said evenly. "Desk work." "For now." He frowned slightly. "You're one of the best we've got on convoy planning." "Apparently I needed a break," I replied, forcing a small smile. Word travels quietly in a unit. By afternoon, a few sideways glances confirmed it. Nothing overt, just subtle shifts. Conversations pausing when I entered. A junior officer whispering to another. It wasn't hostility, more curiosity, maybe skepticism. At my new desk, rows of spreadsheets replaced the open loading bays I was used to. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. My supervisor, Chief Warrant Officer Alvarez, greeted me politely. "Temporary, huh? Happens to all of us." "Yes, ma'am." She handed me a stack of reports. Inventory reconciliation. "Start with these. You're thorough, so it shouldn't take long." I nodded and sat down. The keyboard felt foreign under my hands. Outside the window, I could see the tarmac where cargo trucks lined up, engines idling. A week earlier, I'd been coordinating those runs. Now, I watched from a distance. Mid-afternoon, Captain Miller leaned against my cubicle wall. He was friendly enough, but his tone carried a faint edge. Heard you went rogue for a midnight donation. I saw a post, I said, that's all. He smirked lightly. Saving the world on your own time, huh? Just helping someone. Yeah, well, Command doesn't love surprises. He tapped the desk. Careful, compassion's not always in the SOP. I met his gaze calmly. Neither is ignoring someone bleeding out. He paused, then shrugged. Fair point, still structure matters. He walked away, leaving the faint smell of coffee behind. I returned to the spreadsheet, the numbers blurring slightly before refocusing. The exchange didn't anger me. It simply clarified the line I'd crossed between personal judgment and institutional expectation. That evening, as I left the building, the sky over Norfolk glowed orange with sunset. The wind off the water felt cooler, sharper. I walked past the loading bay, the clatter of chains and engines echoing in the distance. For a moment I wondered if I'd misjudged, if the late-night drive had been impulsive. Then I remembered the hospital hallway, the man's steady voice, the update on my phone patient stable. The doubt eased. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, arm resting on the wood. The faint bruise from the donation had turned yellow at the edges, a small mark already fading. I traced it absently. If I had the choice again, I murmured I'd still go. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed, tires humming on asphalt. I didn't expect recognition. I didn't need it. The uniform teaches you that some decisions live only inside you unseen. Still, as I turned off the light and headed to bed, I felt the subtle weight of the reassignment. Not regret, just the cost of choosing instinct over procedure. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't unfair exactly. It was simply how systems protect themselves. 2 weeks would pass in that quiet space, paperwork, routine, subdued conversations, before the door to my commander's office opened again. And when it did, the man who had only asked my name would be waiting inside wearing 4 stars that would change the meaning of everything. Desk duty has a different kind of silence. Out on the tarmac, noise is constant engines, forklifts, radios, shouted coordinates carried by wind. In administrative support, the quiet is artificial, shaped by fluorescent lights and the low hum of computers. It's the kind of silence that amplifies thought. Every keystroke sounds deliberate. Every pause feels longer than it should. By the end of the first week, I'd memorized the rhythm of the office. Alvarez arrived at 700 sharp, coffee in hand, already scanning reports. 2 specialists rotated inventory checks, their conversations clipped and efficient. A printer near the back wall jammed twice a day like clockwork. The air always smelled faintly of toner and stale air conditioning. It wasn't unpleasant, just contained. I worked steadily, reconciling supply logs, cross-checking manifests, flagging discrepancies. It wasn't difficult. In some ways it was almost restful. But every time I glanced out the narrow window and saw the convoy vehicles lined up, something inside me tightened. I missed the unpredictability, the movement, the feeling that decisions mattered in real time. On the 4th day, Chief Morales stopped by my desk. He'd been with the unit longer than most, a mechanic with hands permanently stained by oil and decades of service. Heard they parked you in here, he said quietly. Temporary, I replied. He nodded, studying the reports spread across my desk. You always were too good for paperwork. I don't mind it. Maybe. But you don't belong here. He leaned slightly closer. They say you left base to donate blood. Yes. He gave a faint, approving grunt. My wife needed O-negative once. Years ago. A stranger showed up, never learned his name. He paused. Sometimes the quiet things matter more than the loud ones. I met his gaze. That's how I see it. Morales nodded and walked off, leaving the faint smell of machine oil behind. His words lingered longer than I expected. They didn't erase the reassignment, but they softened its edges. Not everyone shared his perspective. Captain Miller continued his subtle commentary, never hostile, just lightly dismissive. You're getting real good at spreadsheets, he remarked one afternoon. Maybe they'll keep you in admin permanently. Maybe I said not looking up. He chuckled. Don't take it personally. Command likes predictability. I finished entering a column before responding. So do I, but not at the cost of someone's life. He shrugged. Depends whose responsibility that life is. That night it felt like mine, I said quietly. He didn't answer, just nodded and moved on. The exchange wasn't heated, but it highlighted the divide between procedural clarity and personal judgment. Neither side was entirely wrong, but only one side had seen the hospital hallway at midnight. The second week settled into a steady routine. I arrived early, left late, and avoided unnecessary conversation. The reassignment had a curious effect. It sharpened my focus. If I was going to be here, I would do the work thoroughly. By Wednesday, I'd identified several inventory discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for months. Alvarez thanked me briefly, her tone warm but professional. "You've improved our accuracy already," she said. "That's not nothing." I appreciated that. Recognition, even small, grounded the day. Still, the absence of fieldwork felt like a quiet exile. Evenings were the hardest. After work, I'd sometimes walk along the perimeter road near the water. Norfolk's coastline carried a steady wind, the smell of salt mixing with diesel from passing ships. I'd watch cargo planes taxi in the distance, their lights blinking against the dusk. The scene reminded me of the pace I'd left behind, constant motion, purposeful noise. One night, about 10 days after the donation, my phone buzzed with a notification from the same veterans group. A short update: patient discharged. Recovering well. Family grateful for donors. No names, no details, just closure. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Relief spread slowly, quiet and steady. Whoever he was, he'd made it. The decision that night had helped. That was enough. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and watched the water darken. The wind tugged at my jacket, cool against my face. I thought about the man in the donor room, his calm demeanor, the way he'd repeated my name. I wondered if he'd ever know who I was beyond that moment. Probably not. People move on. Emergencies fade. That's the nature of things. Back in the office the next morning, the routine resumed. Reports, calls, inventory. The reassignment began to feel less temporary, more like a quiet new normal. I accepted it without bitterness. The Army has a way of reshaping expectations. You adapt. Late Friday afternoon, as I finalized a logistics summary, Alvarez stepped into my cubicle. "Major Bennett, you'll want to clear your schedule Monday morning." "Ma'am?" "Command requested you at 0900, Commander's office." I blinked. Any context? She shook her head. "Just marked priority." "Understood." She gave me a curious look, as if trying to read something in my expression, then left. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking at the end of a sentence. My first thought was routine review. Maybe they were reconsidering my assignment. My second thought was less comfortable, another reprimand, perhaps a formal one. The weekend passed quietly. I kept busy laundry, groceries, a phone call with my sister, but the appointment lingered in the background like distant thunder. By Sunday night, I'd convinced myself it would be procedural, nothing more. Monday morning arrived crisp and bright. I pressed my uniform carefully, aligning ribbons, smoothing the collar. The act felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. As I walked across the courtyard toward headquarters, the sunlight reflected off the pavement, sharp and clean. Sailors moved briskly, conversations blending into a steady murmur. Everything looked ordinary. Inside the corridor outside the commander's office was quieter than usual. The aide at the desk glanced up. "Major Bennett, they're expecting you." "Yes." I adjusted my jacket, took a breath, and stepped toward the door. My mind ran through possibilities: evaluation, reassignment, maybe reinstatement. I didn't expect anything dramatic, just another conversation inside the machinery of command. The aide opened the door. "Go ahead, ma'am." I stepped inside and froze. Because seated across from my commander was a man I recognized immediately, even before my eyes registered the uniform. The same calm posture, the same steady gaze, the same quiet presence from the donor room. Only now silver stars gleamed on his shoulders, 4 of them. The silence in the room shifted, heavy and electric. My heart missed a beat as recognition crashed through me. The man who had only asked my name 2 weeks earlier looked up and met my eyes, a faint, knowing expression touching his face. And in that moment I realized the quiet decision I'd made in a hospital chair was about to echo far beyond anything I had imagined. For a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, as if the walls had shifted inward without sound. My mind struggled to reconcile the 2 images, the quiet man in the donor chair and the officer seated before me now. The same gray hair, the same calm expression, but everything else had changed. The uniform was immaculate, deep blue trimmed with gold. On each shoulder rested 4 silver stars catching the morning light from the window. Authority radiated from him, not in posture or volume, but in the stillness he carried, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "Major Bennett," my commander said, breaking the silence, "please come in." I stepped forward, automatically, training taking over. My hand rose in a salute. "Sir." The 4-star officer returned it with crisp precision. "At ease, Major." His voice was exactly as I remembered, measured, calm, familiar. Commander Dwyer cleared his throat. "Major, this is General Thomas Warren, Deputy Commanding General, U.S. Army Medical Command." Recognition rippled through me more fully now. Not just a senior officer, a strategic-level commander, the kind whose decisions shaped entire regions, not individual units. My pulse quickened, though I kept my posture steady. "Good morning, Major Bennett," General Warren said. His eyes held that same faint warmth from the donor room. "I believe we've met." "Yes, sir," I replied quietly. Dwyer looked between us, confusion flickering across his face. "You've met?" General Warren folded his hands. 2 weeks ago, Naval Medical Center, Norfolk, Donor Lounge. The room fell silent again. Dwyer straightened slightly. "I wasn't aware." "I imagine not," the general said. His tone remained calm, but there was weight behind it. He gestured toward the chair opposite the desk. "Please, Major, have a seat." I sat careful to keep my movements composed. The hum of the air conditioning filled the brief pause. Dwyer glanced at a folder on his desk, then back at the general as if recalculating the entire conversation. General Warren spoke first. "Major Bennett, do you recall the reason you came to the hospital that night?" "Yes, sir, an urgent donor request." "You responded immediately?" "Yes, sir." He nodded, without knowing who needed the blood. "Yes, sir." Dwyer shifted slightly. "Sir, if I may." "Of course," Colonel Warren replied. Dwyer leaned forward. "Major Bennett's initiative is commendable. However, she departed base without coordination, which raised concerns about readiness coverage. I reassigned her temporarily while we reviewed." Warren raised a hand gently, not interrupting so much as guiding the conversation. "Understood. And was any mission compromised?" "No, sir." "Any delay in logistics operations?" "No, sir." "Any operational risk realized?" Dwyer hesitated. "No, sir, but—" Then the only issue, Warren said quietly, was procedural deviation. "Yes, sir." The general leaned back, studying the folder. "Major Bennett, did you believe your decision violated protocol?" "Yes, sir, I knew it wasn't coordinated." "And you made the decision anyway?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the room. I chose my words carefully. "Because someone was bleeding, sir, and I could help. Waiting for approval would have taken time." Warren nodded slowly, as if confirming something already decided. "That's what I thought." Dwyer's expression tightened slightly. "Sir, discipline." "Matters," Warren finished. "Yes, Colonel, discipline always matters." He closed the folder. "So does judgment." He turned back to me. "The patient that night was my grandson." The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. I felt the air shift again. Dwyer blinked, caught off guard. "He was in surgery," Warren continued. "Internal bleeding. My daughter posted the donor request when supplies ran low. Your donation arrived within minutes." He paused. It bought them time. I swallowed, unsure what to say. "You didn't know who he was," Warren said. "You didn't know who I was. You simply saw a need and acted." His gaze moved briefly to Dwyer. "That's not recklessness. That's leadership." Dwyer sat very still. "Sir, I didn't." "I know," Warren said calmly. "You applied the regulation. That's your responsibility, but regulations exist to serve people, not replace judgment." He folded his hands again. "Major Bennett made a decision that balanced risk and humanity. She accepted the consequences. That's exactly the kind of officer we want making calls in uncertain situations." The room remained quiet. I felt a mix of relief and disbelief, though I kept my expression neutral. Warren continued. "I requested her file after the hospital visit. Her record reflects consistent performance crisis logistics experience and no prior deviations." He looked directly at Dwyer. Reassignment to administrative duty seems disproportionate. Dwyer nodded slowly. Understood, sir. Warren's voice softened slightly. Colonel, I'm not here to criticize. You followed procedure. But we also need to recognize when an officer demonstrates sound moral judgment. He turned to me again. Major Bennett, would you make the same decision again? Yes, sir, I answered without hesitation. A faint smile touched his lips. Good. He reached for the folder, slid a document forward, and spoke evenly. Effective immediately, the temporary reassignment is lifted. Major Bennett will return to operational planning. Additionally, I'm recommending her for humanitarian coordination duty within the medical logistics framework. Her instincts are suited for it. Dwyer nodded. Yes, sir, I'll implement that. Warren stood the movement unhurried but decisive. Thank you, Colonel. He turned toward me, extending his hand. Major Bennett, you didn't just help my family. You reminded me why we wear this uniform. His grip was firm, steady. Thank you. Thank you, sir, I replied quietly. As he released my hand, the tension in the room eased. Dwyer cleared his throat. Major report to operations after this. We'll reintegrate you immediately. Yes, sir. Warren gave a final nod, then moved toward the door. The sunlight caught the silver stars again, bright against the dark fabric. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the moment settled in fully. 2 weeks earlier, he had been just another man in a quiet donor room. Now his presence had shifted my entire trajectory. I sat there a moment longer, absorbing the change. Dwyer glanced at me, his expression more thoughtful than before. Major Bennett, he said quietly, good call that night. Yes, sir. Outside, the corridor seemed brighter, the noise of the base returning in waves. I walked toward operations, the familiar hum of engines drifting through the open doors. The reassignment was over. The quiet exile had ended. And somewhere down the hall, the man who had only asked my name was leaving 4 stars on his shoulders, carrying with him the echo of a decision made in a hospital chair. By the time I stepped back into the operations bay, the familiar sounds felt sharper than I remembered. Radios crackled with route updates, forklifts hummed across concrete, and a cargo truck idled near the loading dock, its diesel engine vibrating through the floor. For 2 weeks I'd watched this rhythm from behind glass. Now I was inside it again, and everything felt slightly different, lighter, but also heavier with meaning. Lieutenant Harris spotted me first. You're back, he asked, surprise plain in his voice. Looks that way. He nodded, a small grin forming. About time. I moved toward my workstation, sliding into the chair that still bore my nameplate. The surface was unchanged maps, routing sheets, a mug I'd forgotten to take home, but the perspective felt subtly shifted. The reassignment had compressed time-turning routine into reflection. Now each detail seemed more deliberate. A few minutes later, Commander Dwyer entered the bay. Conversations quieted slightly, not out of tension but curiosity. He walked directly toward me. Major Bennett, he said, your reassignment is formally rescinded. You'll resume convoy oversight effective immediately. Additionally, we're establishing a humanitarian response liaison within logistics. I want you to lead the initial framework. Yes, sir. He paused, then added quietly, the general made a compelling point. We need officers who understand both regulation and judgment. I'll do my best, sir. I know you will. He gave a brief nod and moved on. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but I felt the shift in how people looked at me. Not dramatic, just subtle respect where curiosity had been. Miller approached a few minutes later, hands in his pockets. Guess compassion made it into the SOP after all, he said. Guess so. He studied me a moment. I didn't know who you helped. Neither did I. He nodded once. Still, takes conviction. His tone lacked the earlier edge. Welcome back. Thank you. He walked off, leaving the faint smell of coffee behind. The exchange was brief, but it closed a quiet circle. The skepticism had softened into acknowledgement. That afternoon, I immersed myself in planning. Route charts spread across the desk, I coordinated supply movement for a coastal training exercise. The familiar process steadied me, fuel calculations, timing windows, contingency routes. It felt like slipping back into a well-worn uniform. Yet beneath the routine, something else lingered, the knowledge that a small decision had reached beyond my immediate world. Near sunset, Alvarez stopped by, heard you're spearheading a humanitarian coordination role. That's the plan. She smiled faintly. Fits you. Logistics isn't just about numbers. It's about people getting what they need before it's too late. I'm starting to see that more clearly. She nodded. Good, then you'll do well. After she left, I finished the day's reports and stepped outside. The sky over Norfolk glowed amber, the harbor reflecting streaks of gold. A breeze rolled in from the water, carrying the smell of salt and distant engines. I walked toward the pier boots, echoing softly on the wooden planks. I wasn't expecting anyone. The quiet felt earned. But halfway down the pier, I saw him, General Warren, standing near the railing, hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon. He turned slightly as I approached. Major Bennett, he said, I thought I might find you out here. Sir. He gestured toward the water. Beautiful evening. Yes, sir. We stood side by side, the silence comfortable. The harbor lights flickered on one by one, reflecting in the darkening water. After a moment, he spoke. My grandson is recovering well, he said. He asked about the person who donated. I told him her name. I'm glad he's okay, sir. He will be. Warren paused. You know, when I arrived at the hospital that night, I didn't expect anything. I just hoped someone would come. Then I saw you sitting there, calm, steady. It reminded me of something my first commander told me decades ago. What was that, sir? That leadership isn't measured by how well you follow orders. It's measured by what you do when orders don't exist. He glanced at me. You understood that instinctively. I considered the words. I just did what felt necessary. That's exactly why it mattered. He rested his hands on the railing. Systems are important. They keep us consistent. But they can also make us forget why we built them. You didn't forget. The wind tugged lightly at our uniforms. The sound of distant gulls drifted across the water. I've recommended a directive, he continued. Encouraging humanitarian response within reasonable judgment. Nothing radical. Just a reminder that compassion isn't incompatible with discipline. That's a good balance, sir. He nodded. You inspired it. That's not something many officers do. I felt a quiet warmth at the words, tempered by humility. I didn't intend to change anything. Most meaningful changes begin that way, he replied. We watched the water in silence for a while. The last streaks of sunlight faded, leaving the harbor bathed in soft blue. Finally, he turned. I'll be leaving Norfolk tomorrow, he said. Before I go, I wanted to thank you again, not as a general, just as a grandfather. You're welcome, sir. He extended his hand. I shook it firmly, the gesture simple but significant. Keep trusting your judgment, Major Bennett, he said. The uniform needs that. Yes, sir. He walked back toward headquarters, his silhouette merging with the evening shadows. I remained at the railing, breathing in the cool air. The past 2 weeks replayed in my mind the reassignment, the quiet doubt, the sudden reversal. It felt less like a dramatic turn and more like a lesson unfolding slowly. Honor doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it moves through quiet decisions unnoticed until the right moment reveals their weight. As the last light disappeared, I turned back toward the operations building. Tomorrow would bring new assignments, new routes, new demands. But the memory of that donor chair and the man who had only asked my name would remain a quiet compass guiding future choices. The morning after General Warren left Norfolk, the base felt unchanged at first glance. The same gulls circled over the harbor, the same trucks rolled across the loading yard, the same smell of diesel and salt hung in the air. But beneath the routine, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't written on a memo or announced over the intercom. It lived in tone and posture, in the way conversations paused and resumed with a little more thought. By 800, I was already in the operations room reviewing a draft framework for the new humanitarian coordination role. It wasn't elaborate, just a structured guideline for responding to civilian emergencies within operational limits. The language was careful, balanced between discipline and discretion. The first line read, "When lives are at immediate risk, officers may act within reasonable judgment, provided operational integrity is preserved." I stared at that sentence for a long moment. 2 weeks earlier, it might have felt controversial. Now it felt simply right. Commander Dwyer stepped in quietly. "How's the draft?" "Solid start, sir. We'll need thresholds for response authority." He nodded. "Agreed. Keep it practical. No one wants vague policy." "I'll add decision criteria." He folded his arms, studying the document. "General Warren called this morning. He wants a pilot program running within 30 days. That's ambitious." "He believes in momentum." Dwyer gave a faint smile. "So do I now." After he left, I continued refining the framework. The work felt purposeful, grounded in something larger than routine logistics. Each line carried weight, the idea that compassion could coexist with structure, that initiative wouldn't automatically be punished. Midday, Harris leaned against my desk, heard about the new directive. "They're calling it the Bennett Clause." I looked up surprised. "I hope not." He chuckled. "Not official, just what people are saying." His tone softened. "It's a good thing, makes us think." "That's enough for me." He nodded and moved on. The afternoon passed quickly. By evening, the first draft circulated through command. Comments trickled in, minor adjustments, clarifications. Nothing hostile, nothing dismissive. The shift felt real. Later, I walked back to the pier. The wind was calmer than the night before, the water almost glassy. I leaned against the railing, watching a tugboat guide a cargo ship toward open water. The quiet allowed the past weeks to settle fully. The hospital, the reassignment, the 4 stars. Each piece now fit into a single line of cause and effect. A voice behind me broke the silence. "Mind if I join you?" I turned. It was Chief Morales' hands in his jacket pockets. "Not at all." He nodded toward the water. "Heard they're writing new rules because of you." "Because of a decision I corrected." "Same thing. He studied me. Funny how the small moments end up shaping the big ones." "I didn't expect anything." "No one does." He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his face. "Back in '98, I stopped a convoy to help a stranded bus. Got chewed out for hours. Years later, they added a clause for civilian aid. Didn't change the world, just made it a little kinder." I smiled faintly. "That's enough." He nodded. "Always is." He left after a few minutes, footsteps fading behind me. The harbor lights reflected in the water like scattered stars. I thought about the man in the donor room, how quiet the moment had been, how easily it could have passed unnoticed. Yet it had rippled outward, touching policy perception and my own path. The next morning brought another surprise. A formal email awaited in my inbox: temporary promotion to acting humanitarian logistics coordinator. The title sounded grander than the role, but the responsibility was real. I read the message twice, absorbing the change. By noon, I was briefing a small team, 2 officers, 1 civilian liaison, on emergency response coordination. The discussion felt natural, grounded in shared purpose. We mapped out potential scenarios: disaster relief, urgent medical supply runs, donor coordination with local hospitals. Each plan traced back in some quiet way to that night in the donor chair. Weeks passed, and the framework took shape. The directive became official. Training sessions began. Younger officers asked thoughtful questions. What if we're unsure? How do we balance timing? And I answered carefully, emphasizing judgment over impulse. The tone of the unit shifted gradually. Not dramatically, just enough to be felt. One afternoon, a letter arrived in interoffice mail. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Inside, a short note. "Major Bennett, my grandson is back in school. He still asks about the night you came in." I told him the truth, that a stranger chose to help without knowing who he was. He said he wants to be that kind of person someday. I thought you should know. T.W. I read it twice, then folded it carefully. No rank, no signature block, just initials. It felt more meaningful that way. I placed the letter in my desk drawer and stepped outside. The afternoon sun warmed the concrete. Trucks rolled past, engines steady. Life moved forward unchanged and yet subtly altered. Sometimes honor doesn't arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it begins in a quiet hospital chair with a simple choice to act. It grows slowly, carried by people who notice, who remember, who decide to shape the future a little differently. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever faced a moment where doing the right thing felt inconvenient or uncertain, consider sharing it. Let someone else know that small decisions matter. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you've had your own moment like this. We share these stories not for applause, but to remind each other that kindness like service never truly retires. And if you'd like to hear more journeys like this, quiet acts, unexpected turns, and the dignity that follows, stay with us, because there are many more stories waiting.